A man's skeleton was found at the bottom of an abandoned well with a concrete slab deliberately placed over his body, and the truth about how he got there would shatter an entire community. October the 24th, 2003. Thomas Reed woke up before dawn, just like he had done hundreds of times before. The air was crisp, carrying that distinct bite of early autumn that every hunter knows means the season has truly arrived. He was 52 years old, built solid from years of manual labor, with calloused hands and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing the wilderness like the back of those same weathered hands. His wife, Margaret, stirred as he moved around their bedroom in the pre-dawn darkness. She didn't need to ask where he was going. After 28 years of marriage, the ritual was familiar. Thomas would hunt, she would worry just enough to remind him she cared, and he would come home by sunset with either a story or venison for the freezer, sometimes both. "Be careful out there," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Always am," Thomas replied, leaning down to kiss her forehead. His beard scratched her skin gently. "I'll be back before dinner. Maybe we'll have something to celebrate." Those were the last words Margaret Reed would hear her husband speak. Thomas dressed in layers, a base thermal shirt, his favorite flannel, and over it all, his hunting jacket. The jacket was unmistakable, forest green with orange safety panels and a distinctive tear on the left sleeve that Margaret had offered to repair a dozen times. Thomas always refused. He said the tear had a story from the time he'd helped pull a friend's truck out of a ditch 3 years back. The jacket was broken in, comfortable, lucky even. He wouldn't hunt without it. He grabbed his rifle from the locked cabinet in the basement, checked it with the practiced efficiency of someone who respected firearms, and loaded his gear into his Ford F-150. The truck was 11 years old, but reliable, with over 200,000 miles that spoke to Thomas's practical nature. He didn't need fancy. He needed dependable. The drive to the Appalachian Mountains would take just under 2 hours from his home in the small town of Millbrook. Thomas had scouted the area weeks earlier, identifying a promising section of forest on the eastern slope where deer trails converged near a creek. He'd even marked the spot on his topographic map with a red circle, folding the map carefully and placing it in his glove compartment. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as the truck's taillights disappeared down their gravel driveway. The red glow faded into the darkness, and she returned to bed, expecting to see those same lights return before the day was done. But the lights never came back. As afternoon stretched into evening, Margaret felt the first flutter of real concern. Thomas was never late, not without calling. She tried his cell phone 3 times, each call going straight to voicemail. That wasn't unusual in the mountains. Cell service was spotty at best, but combined with his absence, it made her stomach tighten with worry. By 8 o'clock that evening, with full darkness settled over Millbrook, Margaret called the sheriff's department. Deputy Frank Holloway took her report. He was a man in his early 40s with a daughter about to graduate high school and a wife who reminded him constantly not to dismiss worried spouses. He listened carefully as Margaret described Thomas's plans, his destination, his vehicle. "Mrs. Reed, I'm sure he's fine," Holloway said, though his training told him to take every missing person report seriously. "Hunters lose track of time. Maybe his truck won't start. Maybe he got a flat tire in an area with no service. We'll send someone up first light to check the usual spots." But Margaret Reed knew her husband. Thomas is experienced. He knows these woods. He wouldn't just disappear. The desperation in her voice cut through the deputy's practiced reassurance. He promised to dispatch a patrol immediately to begin preliminary searching, though in the dark, options were limited. What they found 3 hours later made everything infinitely worse. At 11:47 p.m., Deputy Holloway's radio crackled with a location. Thomas Reed's truck had been found in the parking area where the Forest Service road ended, exactly where Margaret said it would be. The spot was a popular staging area for hunters, a small clearing with room for maybe 6 vehicles where the pavement gave way to dirt trails. When Holloway arrived on scene, his flashlight beam swept across the F-150. The truck sat alone in the darkness, positioned neatly in the clearing as if Thomas had every intention of returning to it. Nothing appeared disturbed. No broken windows, no signs of struggle, no indication anything was wrong. But when Holloway tried the door, it was locked. He peered through the window with his flashlight. What he saw made his chest tighten. Inside the truck, Thomas Reed's hunting rifle sat in its case on the passenger seat. His backpack was still there, stuffed with the supplies any smart hunter would bring: water, energy bars, first aid kit, emergency blanket. His hunting knife was clipped to the outside of the pack. Even his boots, his good hiking boots with the aggressive tread, sat on the floor of the back seat. Thomas Reed had driven 2 hours to hunt, parked his truck, and then apparently walked into the Appalachian wilderness in whatever shoes he'd worn to drive, without his rifle, without his gear, without his knife, without any logical reason whatsoever. "This doesn't make any sense," Holloway muttered into his radio, requesting backup and a K-9 unit. "It's like he just vanished into thin air." The deputy walked the perimeter with his flashlight, searching for any clue. The ground was hard-packed dirt and scattered leaves, not ideal for tracking, but he looked anyway. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading into the tree line that he could definitively identify. Just an abandoned truck full of unused gear and a growing list of questions that had no good answers. The question that would haunt everyone wasn't just where Thomas Reed had gone. It was why he would leave everything behind. By first light on October 25th, the forest was swarming with searchers. The sheriff's department mobilized every available deputy. The local volunteer fire department showed up with 20 men. By noon, over 100 volunteers from surrounding communities had joined the effort, forming search lines that swept through the dense Appalachian forest in methodical patterns. Margaret Reed stood at the command post they had established near Thomas's truck, wrapped in a blanket someone had given her despite the afternoon sun. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by fear. Her sister stood beside her, arm around her shoulders, while Margaret stared into the tree line as if sheer force of will could make her husband emerge from the shadows. Search and rescue coordinator Ellen Vasquez had worked missing person cases for 15 years, and something about this one bothered her from the start. She'd seen plenty of lost hunters, some found alive and embarrassed, some found dead from exposure or accidents, some never found at all. But the truck situation was unprecedented in her experience. "Most lost hunters, they take their gear and get disoriented," she explained to the assembled volunteers during the initial briefing. "They walk in circles, get turned around, sometimes panic and make poor decisions. But they start with their gear. This man didn't. Which means either something happened before he could gear up, or," she didn't finish the sentence, "the other possibility, that Thomas hadn't been planning to hunt at all, that the hunting trip was a cover for something else. Open doors no one wanted to walk through yet, not with his wife standing 50 feet away, hope and terror written across her face in equal measure. The K-9 units arrived with 3 trained search dogs. They started at the truck, letting the dogs catch Thomas's scent from clothing Margaret had brought from home. All 3 dogs behaved strangely. They circled the truck, whined, and refused to pick up a trail. One dog handler, a grizzled man named Marcus who'd worked search and rescue for 2 decades, shook his head in frustration. "They're getting confused," Marcus explained. "They smell him at the truck, but there's no scent trail leading away. It's like he just stopped existing right here." "Yeah, that's impossible," Ellen Vasquez said flatly. "I know," Marcus replied, "but that's what the dogs are telling me. They tried anyway. The handlers walked the dogs in widening circles from the truck, hoping to pick up something, anything. For 3 hours, they found nothing. Then, approximately 200 yards northeast of the parking area, one of the dogs suddenly became alert, pulling toward a specific direction. Hope surged through the search teams. The dog led them for another quarter mile, everyone following with renewed energy, before the trail went cold again at a small stream. The dog circled, confused, losing the scent at the water. They searched both banks for another 2 hours, but found nothing. "He crossed the water," Ellen theorized, "but which way? Upstream, downstream, or straight across?" They split into 3 groups and searched all 3 directions. They found nothing. As the sun set on the first full day of searching, over 8 square miles of forest had been covered. More than 200 people had combed through underbrush, checked ravines, called Thomas's name until their voices went hoarse. Helicopter overflights with thermal imaging had been conducted, searching for any heat signature that might indicate a person. They found absolutely nothing. That night, Margaret Reed refused to leave the command post. She sat in a folding chair someone had brought her, staring at the dark tree line, wondering if somewhere in that vast darkness her husband could hear them calling his name. The question no one was asking yet, but everyone was thinking, how does an experienced outdoorsman with a truck full of gear vanish so completely in familiar territory? Days became weeks. The massive search effort that had mobilized hundreds of volunteers in the first week gradually scaled down as the reality of the situation set in. The Appalachian Mountains are vast, unforgiving, and full of places where a body could rest undiscovered for years, or forever. By the end of the first week, the official search had covered over 25 square miles. They'd used thermal imaging, brought in cadaver dogs, even had volunteer climbers check cliff faces and crevices where someone might have fallen. Nothing. No clothing, no blood, no sign Thomas Reed had ever set foot in those woods. The investigation shifted. If Thomas didn't walk into the forest, then what happened? Detective Sarah Chen from the state police took over the case. She was methodical, thorough, and increasingly convinced they were looking at something more complicated than a missing hunter. Her first move was to investigate Thomas Reed's life. Who was he? What was his state of mind? Were there any factors that might explain a disappearance? What she found was frustratingly ordinary. Thomas Reed was by all accounts exactly who he appeared to be. He'd worked for the same construction company for 26 years, most recently as a foreman. His co-workers described him as reliable, skilled, fair-minded. He showed up on time, did good work, went home to his wife. No drama. His finances were stable, not wealthy, but comfortable. The mortgage on his modest home was nearly paid off. He had a small retirement account, no significant debts, and no recent large withdrawals or suspicious transactions. His marriage to Margaret appeared solid. Friends described them as one of those couples who genuinely still liked each other after decades together. They had 2 adult children, a son living in Texas and a daughter in Pennsylvania, both of whom flew home immediately when they heard their father was missing. Both insisted there was no possibility their father would disappear voluntarily. "My dad loved us," his daughter Amanda said, tears streaming down her face. "He was excited about being a grandfather. My son is due in 3 months. Dad was building a crib in his workshop. He would never just leave. Never." Detective Chen visited that workshop. It was in a detached garage behind the Reed house, organized with the precise care of someone who respected his tools. A half-finished project sat on workbenches. The crib Amanda mentioned, some kitchen cabinets Thomas had been building for a neighbor, a rocking chair that was nearly complete. These weren't the projects of a man planning to disappear. Medical records showed no terminal illnesses, no diagnoses that might trigger a crisis. Friends said Thomas had been in good spirits before the hunting trip, maybe a little stressed, but nothing unusual. When pressed, several people mentioned the same source of that stress, his ongoing dispute with his neighbor, Christopher Doyle. And that's where things got interesting. Christopher Doyle lived on the property adjacent to the Reeds. The 2 properties shared a fence line that ran for nearly a quarter mile through woods and field. For years, the relationship between the 2 men had been civil, if not warm. They weren't friends who borrowed each other's tools, but they weren't enemies either. They'd wave across the fence, occasionally chat about weather or deer sightings. That changed 3 years ago. The dispute started over something absurdly mundane: trees. A row of old oaks stood right along the property line, their roots and branches extending onto both properties. Thomas wanted to trim some branches that overhung his land. Christopher insisted the trees were on his property, and Thomas had no right to touch them. What started as a disagreement escalated. There were arguments across the fence line, raised voices. Christopher called the county to report Thomas for trespassing. Thomas hired a surveyor who confirmed the trees were actually on the property line, shared between both lots. Christopher disputed the survey results, hiring his own surveyor who claimed the line was different. The dispute went to court. The judge ruled largely in Thomas's favor, establishing the property line exactly where Thomas's surveyor had placed it. Christopher was ordered to pay court costs and Thomas's legal fees, a total of about $4,000. Christopher Doyle had been furious. "He told me Thomas had humiliated him. A mutual acquaintance told Detective Chen. Said Thomas made him look like a fool and he'd never forget it, but I thought it was just angry talk. You know, the kind of thing people say when they're upset but don't mean. Chen interviewed Christopher Doyle on November 3rd, 10 days after Thomas disappeared. Doyle was 57 years old, a retired machinist who lived alone after his wife left him 5 years prior. His property was larger than the Reeds, with a house, several outbuildings, and an old barn that predated both current structures. He had no criminal record beyond a DUI from 1994. When Chen arrived at his property, Doyle met her at the door with a guarded expression. He was a tall man, over 6 feet, with the kind of lean build that suggested either an active lifestyle or poor eating habits. His face was weathered, his hair gray and thin, his eyes the pale blue of winter sky. I already talked to deputies, Doyle said before Chen could introduce herself properly. I told them everything I know, which is nothing. I understand, Mr. Doyle. I just have a few follow-up questions. May I come in? He hesitated, then stepped aside. The interior of his house was dim, cluttered but not dirty. Papers and mail covered most surfaces. The air smelled stale. Chen asked about his whereabouts on October 24th. Doyle said he'd been home all day, working on projects around his property. No alibi, no witnesses, but also no reason for anyone to suspect him of anything beyond being a difficult neighbor. Did you see or hear anything unusual that day? Any vehicles on the road? Anyone walking by? No, I mind my own business. What was your relationship with Thomas Reed like? Doyle's jaw tightened. He was my neighbor. That's it. I understand you two had a property dispute. That was settled. Ancient history. Did you harbor any ill will toward Mr. Reed? I didn't wish the man harm, if that's what you're asking. We weren't friends, but I didn't want him dead. It was the first time anyone had used that word. Dead. Chen watched Doyle's face carefully. Nothing, no reaction, no emotion. Just that same guarded blankness. She asked a few more questions, thanked him for his time, and left. Driving back down his long driveway, she made notes in her recorder. Subject defensive, but not overtly hostile. No obvious deception, but also no warmth or concern for missing neighbor. Worth another look. What she didn't know then was that Christopher Doyle would become the focus of everything. But that would take time, and a gruesome discovery. But for now, the case grew cold, and the question remained. What happened to Thomas Reed? The first year was the hardest. Margaret Reed existed in a state of agonizing limbo, unable to grieve properly because there was no body, no proof, no certainty. Hope and despair took turns crushing her. She couldn't bring herself to clean out Thomas's closet. His clothes still hung there, his scent slowly fading from the fabric. His toothbrush remained in its holder. His reading glasses sat on the nightstand beside a book he'd been halfway through. The workshop remained exactly as he'd left it, the half-built crib gathering dust. Well-meaning friends told her she needed to move on, accept reality, start rebuilding her life. But how could she? Thomas wasn't declared dead. He was just missing. Somewhere out there, maybe, his body lay undiscovered, or maybe, and this was the thought that kept her awake at night, maybe something worse had happened. Maybe someone had taken him. Maybe he'd suffered. Maybe he'd called out for help and no one had heard. The not knowing was torture. Detective Chen periodically called with updates, though there was rarely anything to report. The case remained open, but inactive. Every few months, Chen would follow up on a tip or a lead. A hiker reported seeing someone matching Thomas's description, or a hunter found torn clothing in the woods, but nothing ever panned out. The Reed children tried to be supportive, but they had their own lives. Amanda gave birth to her son 3 months after her father disappeared. She named him Thomas, and when she told her mother, both women cried for an hour. The crib the first Thomas had been building would never be finished. Amanda bought one from a store, but it felt wrong, like giving up. The second year was different, not easier, but different. Margaret started to accept that Thomas was gone, even if she didn't know how or why. She began attending a support group for families of missing persons. The stories she heard there were heartbreaking. Parents whose children vanished, siblings who disappeared, spouses who walked out the door and never returned. Everyone in that room understood her pain in a way others couldn't. She learned that thousands of people go missing in the United States every year. Most are found quickly. Some are never found. A few become statistics, cold cases, mysteries that outlive everyone who loved them. Margaret refused to let Thomas become a statistic. She kept his case in the public eye. She worked with local news stations to run anniversary pieces. She maintained a Facebook page dedicated to finding information about his disappearance. She contacted other search and rescue organizations, hoping fresh eyes might see something the original search missed. Nothing worked. By year 3, even Detective Chen's calls became less frequent. The case was cold, not officially closed, but frozen in time, waiting for something, anything, to break it open again. That break came in the spring of 2007, but not in any way anyone could have predicted. And when it came, it would prove that the truth was darker than anyone had imagined. April 14th, 2007. 4 teenagers decided to explore the old Morrison farm. The property had been abandoned for over a decade, ever since Harold Morrison died without heirs, and the bank repossessed the land. The house had long since been stripped by scavengers and vandals. The barn had partially collapsed. Nature was reclaiming everything, vines and saplings pushing through floorboards and wrapping around fence posts. It was exactly the kind of place teenagers found irresistible. Jake Matthews, 17, had suggested the adventure to his friends. They'd packed flashlights and a couple of beers someone's older brother had bought them, planning to explore the ruins and maybe drink away from adult supervision. It was stupid, harmless teenage rebellion. The 4 of them, Jake, his girlfriend Riley, and their friends Marcus and Devin, parked at the end of the overgrown driveway and walked up to the property just after sunset. The house was too dangerous to enter. The floors were rotting through, so they headed for the barn instead. That's when Devin noticed the well. It was old, probably original to the farm's founding in the 1890s. A circular stone structure about 4 feet high with a wooden cover that had rotted away in places. Weeds and small trees grew around it. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd walk right past it. "Check it out," Devin said, approaching the well. "Think there's still water down there?" "Probably just snakes and dead raccoons," Riley said, hanging back. Jake pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight, shining it down into the darkness. The well was deep, maybe 40 feet, and the light from his phone didn't reach the bottom. He picked up a rock and dropped it in, counting seconds until he heard the impact. But there was no splash, just a dull thud. "It's dry," Marcus observed. "Been dry a long time, probably." Something about the sound bothered Jake. It wasn't quite right, not the hollow thud you'd expect from a rock hitting dirt or dry stone. There was something dense about it. "Hold my phone," Jake said to Riley, handing her his device. Before anyone could ask what he was doing, he'd pulled a small LED flashlight from his pocket, the good one his dad used for camping, and dropped it into the well. The flashlight tumbled end over end, its beam spinning through the darkness like a strobe light. When it hit bottom, it bounced once and came to rest, illuminating the bottom of the well, and that's when Riley started screaming. At the bottom of the well, clearly visible in the bright LED beam, was a human skeleton. It lay on its back, arms sprawled at odd angles, the skull tilted to one side. Tattered remnants of clothing still clung to the bones, and beside the skeleton, partially covering it, was a broken concrete slab, the kind used for paving or foundations, that had apparently been placed over the body at some point, but had cracked and shifted. The teenagers ran. They left the flashlight, left their beers, ran back to the car with Riley crying and Devin vomiting in the bushes from shock. Jake called 911 with shaking hands, barely able to explain what they'd found. "There's a body," he kept repeating. "There's a body in the well." Oh God, there's a body. By midnight, the old Morrison farm was a crime scene, lit up with portable lights and swarming with police, or a recovery team prepared to descend into the well while detectives documented everything. Detective Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the well, looking down at the skeleton. She'd received the call at home, interrupting a rare evening off. When dispatch mentioned the location, the old Morrison farm, something had clicked in her mind. She'd pulled out her case files, looking for something she remembered from years ago. The Morrison farm was less than 3 miles from Christopher Doyle's property, and Christopher Doyle's property was adjacent to Thomas Reed's. "Get a dental x-ray unit out here," Chen ordered, "and contact Margaret Reed. Tell her we may have found her husband." She didn't want to give the woman false hope, but the timing was right, the location was right, and that concrete slab wasn't an accident. Someone had put it there. Someone had tried to hide this body. The recovery took 4 hours. They couldn't use heavy equipment without potentially destroying evidence, so 2 members of the recovery team descended into the well using ropes and harnesses, carefully photographing and documenting everything before moving the remains. What they found told a story. The skeleton was complete, suggesting the body had been placed there intact, not scattered by animals. The concrete slab had been on top of the body, not something that fell in by accident, but something deliberately placed. Most telling were the bones themselves. The forensic anthropologist on scene, Dr. Robert Lansing, made preliminary observations before the remains were even removed. "Adult male, mid-40s to mid-50s based on bone development and wear," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the well. "Multiple fractures to the skull, ribs, and left arm. These fractures show no signs of healing, which means they occurred at or near time of death. This individual suffered significant blunt force trauma." "We're talking murder," Chen said. It wasn't a question. "I'd say that's a very safe assumption," Dr. Lansing replied. The remains were transported to the medical examiner's office. Dental records were requested from Thomas Reed's dentist. Margaret Reed was asked to provide DNA samples for comparison. The wait was agonizing. 48 hours for dental record comparison, another 24 for DNA confirmation. On April 17, 2007, Detective Chen drove to the Reed house personally to deliver the news. Margaret answered the door in her bathrobe, though it was mid-afternoon. She looked older than her 54 years, worn down by years of not knowing. One look at Chen's face told her everything. "It's him," Margaret whispered. "Isn't it?" "The dental records are a positive match," Chen said gently. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Reed." "But we found Thomas." Margaret didn't cry, not then. She just stood there, swaying slightly, her face going pale. Chen reached out to steady her, helping her to a chair. "How?" Margaret finally asked. "How did he die?" "That's what we're going to find out," Chen promised. "But Mrs. Reed, I need you to understand something. Based on what we found, Thomas's death wasn't an accident. We're investigating this as a homicide." The word hung in the air. Homicide. Someone had killed Thomas Reed, hidden his body in an abandoned well, and covered it with concrete to make sure it stayed hidden. The question now was, who? But Detective Chen already had a suspect in mind. The moment the remains were positively identified as Thomas Reed, the case file changed. What had been a missing person investigation became a murder investigation. And everything looked different through that lens. Detective Chen assembled her team and started from scratch, rebuilding the timeline with new understanding. October 24th, 2003. Thomas Reed leaves home at approximately 5:30 a.m., telling his wife he's going hunting. His truck is found that evening with all his gear inside, but no sign of Thomas. The truck is locked. This meant Thomas never made it to his hunting spot. Something happened before he could even start his hunt. But what? Chen studied maps measuring distances. Thomas's house to Christopher Doyle's property, 1.4 miles. Doyle's property to the Morrison farm, 2.8 miles. The Morrison farm to where Thomas's truck was found, 6.2 miles. If someone had killed Thomas and needed to hide the body, the old Morrison farm wasn't a random choice. It was relatively close, completely abandoned, and known to locals. Someone familiar with the area would know about that well. Someone like Christopher Doyle. Chen obtained a warrant to search Doyle's property. On April 20th, 2007, a team of forensic investigators descended on the property with cadaver dogs, luminol, and equipment to search for any trace evidence that might link Doyle to Thomas Reed's death. Doyle met them at the door, furious. "This is harassment. I haven't done anything." "Mr. Doyle, we have a warrant," Chen said calmly, handing him the papers. Please step outside while we conduct our search. The search would take 2 full days. They examined every building on the property, the house, the barn, 2 storage sheds, and a workshop. The workshop proved most interesting. It was a separate building, maybe 20 by 30 feet, with concrete floors and fluorescent lighting. Tools hung on pegboards in organized rows. A large workbench dominated one wall. Everything was neat, orderly, almost obsessively so. Too clean, Chen thought. They sprayed the floor with luminol. In several spots near the workbench, the chemical reacted, glowing bright blue in the darkness, the telltale sign of blood that had been cleaned but not completely eliminated. Someone had scrubbed this floor, scrubbed it hard, but you can't completely remove blood from concrete. Take samples, Chen ordered. I want DNA analysis on everything that reacts. While the forensics team worked, other investigators searched the house. It was in the attic, buried under boxes of old files and Christmas decorations, that they found it. A hunting jacket, forest green with orange safety panels, with a distinctive tear on the left sleeve. The investigator who found it, Officer James Preston, felt his heart rate spike when he saw it. He'd read the case file. He knew about Thomas Reed's jacket, the one Margaret described, the one with the story about pulling a friend's truck from a ditch. "Detective," he called down through the attic access, "you need to see this." Chen climbed up, her breath catching when Preston showed her the jacket. She didn't touch it, didn't want to contaminate potential evidence, but she looked closely. The tear on the sleeve matched the description perfectly, and there, on the front of the jacket, were dark stains that looked suspiciously like old blood. "Bag it," she said quietly, "and let's find out whose blood that is." The forensic results took 3 weeks. DNA analysis isn't quick, despite what television shows suggest, but when the results came back, they were damning. The blood on the workshop floor matched Thomas Reed's DNA. The blood on the jacket matched Thomas Reed's DNA, and the jacket itself, with its distinctive tear and make, was positively identified by Margaret Reed as belonging to her husband. He'd been wearing it the day he disappeared. On May 11, 2007, Detective Chen arrested Christopher Doyle for the murder of Thomas Reed. Christopher Doyle sat in the interrogation room, handcuffed to the table, his expression one of controlled fury. Chen let him sit for 30 minutes before entering, a standard technique to let anxiety build. When she finally walked in with her partner, Detective Ramon Torres, Doyle looked at her with undisguised hatred. "I want a lawyer," were his first words. "That's your right," Chen said calmly, setting down a folder, "but you might want to hear what we found first. Because right now, you're the only suspect in a murder investigation, and the evidence against you is substantial. If you have an explanation, now would be the time to give it. I didn't kill anyone. Then explain why Thomas Reed's blood is on your workshop floor. Explain why his jacket was hidden in your attic. Explain why his body was found 3 miles from your property with a concrete slab over it, a slab that matches samples we found in your barn." Doyle's face went pale. "I'm not saying anything without a lawyer." The interrogation ended there, at least officially. A public defender was appointed. Doyle couldn't afford a private attorney, and the case began moving through the criminal justice system. But while Doyle awaited trial in county jail, detectives continued investigating, building their case piece by piece. The concrete slab found in the well was indeed a match for concrete stored on Doyle's property. The mixture was distinctive, with a particular ratio of aggregates that forensic analysis confirmed was consistent with batches Doyle had mixed himself for various property projects. More importantly, investigators found records of Doyle's vehicle movements. His truck had been caught on a traffic camera on the morning of October 24, 2003, at 6:47 a.m., traveling on the road that connected his property to the main highway. The image wasn't clear enough to see who was driving or what was in the truck bed, but it established that Doyle's vehicle had been on the move around the time Thomas Reed disappeared. Witness interviews revealed more pieces of the puzzle. A former co-worker of Doyle's mentioned that Christopher had seemed off in the weeks after Thomas disappeared, quieter than usual, more withdrawn. Another neighbor reported seeing Doyle's truck loaded with what looked like concrete sacks heading in the direction of the Morrison farm in late October 2003, though she couldn't remember the exact date. The timeline Chen constructed went like this. Thomas Reed, leaves home at 5:30 a.m. on October 24th, planning to drive to his hunting spot. But his route takes him past Christopher Doyle's property. Somehow, and this part remained unclear, Thomas ends up at Doyle's property instead. Maybe Doyle flagged him down. Maybe there was a problem that needed addressing. Maybe Thomas stopped to confront Doyle about something. Whatever the reason, Thomas Reed entered Christopher Doyle's workshop. An argument ensued. The argument turned physical. Doyle struck Thomas multiple times with a blunt object, possibly a hammer or wrench, something common in a workshop. The blows to Thomas's skull were fatal. Doyle panicked. He had a body in his workshop and no good explanation. He needed it to disappear. He likely waited until dark, less chance of being seen. He loaded Thomas's body into his truck, drove to the Morrison farm under cover of darkness, and dumped the body into the old well. Later, he returned with concrete to seal the well, ensuring the body would never be found. Then, he dealt with Thomas's truck. The keys would have been in Thomas's pocket. Doyle drove the truck to the hunting area parking lot, locked it from inside, and climbed out through the window before rolling it up most of the way. He wiped down surfaces to remove his fingerprints. Then he walked the several miles back to his property through the woods, a long walk but doable, and it avoided being seen on roads. It was a calculated plan executed by someone who knew the area intimately. The one thing that threatened everything was the jacket. Doyle should have buried it with the body or burned it. Instead, he'd kept it, hidden in his attic, maybe as some kind of trophy, maybe because he couldn't bring himself to destroy something so tangible. Or maybe he'd just forgotten it was there, hidden under boxes where no one would look until they did. But Chen still needed something more. Physical evidence was strong, but juries liked confessions. She needed Christopher Doyle to tell her what happened that morning, to admit what he'd done. That confession would come, but it would take months and the pressure of an impending trial to break him. Christopher Doyle's trial was scheduled for September 2007. His public defender, a competent if overworked attorney named Patricia Morse, faced an uphill battle. The evidence was overwhelming: DNA, the jacket, the concrete match, the location of the body. She advised Doyle to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, maybe avoid the death penalty, which the prosecution was considering. But Doyle refused. "I'm not admitting to something I didn't do," he insisted during their meetings, even as the evidence mounted against him. Morse didn't believe him. In her 15 years as a public defender, she'd developed a sense for when clients were lying. Doyle was lying, but it was her job to defend him anyway, so she prepared for trial, looking for any weakness in the prosecution's case. Meanwhile, Detective Chen continued digging. Something about the case still bothered her. The physical evidence was solid, but the motive felt thin. A property dispute from 3 years ago? Yes, Doyle had been angry about losing in court. Yes, he'd had to pay Thomas's legal fees. But was that really enough to drive a man to murder? She interviewed more people who knew both men. Thomas's co-workers, Doyle's former colleagues, neighbors who'd witnessed their interactions. Most confirmed the basic story. The two men had a contentious relationship after the property dispute, but no one had witnessed anything that suggested violence was imminent. Then she found Martin Hughes. Hughes was a retired electrician who'd done work for both Reed and Doyle over the years. He was 73 years old, living in a nursing home after a stroke left him partially paralyzed. When Chen visited him, he could barely speak, his words slurred and difficult to understand, but his memory was sharp. "They fought," Hughes managed, struggling with each word. "More than people knew." Chen leaned forward. "About the property line?" Hughes shook his head with effort. "Water." "Water? What about water?" It took Hughes 20 minutes to explain, with Chen patiently wading through each labored word. But the story that emerged added crucial context. The property dispute hadn't just been about trees, it was about water rights. A natural spring emerged on the property line between the two houses. For decades, both properties had drawn water from this spring for various uses, not drinking water, but irrigation, livestock, general property maintenance. The spring was technically on Thomas's property, but by tradition and long use, both families had always accessed it. When the boundary dispute went to court and the judge ruled the property line placed the spring squarely on Thomas's land, Thomas had exercised his legal right to restrict Christopher's access to it, not out of spite, according to Hughes, but because his insurance company advised him to for liability reasons. If Doyle got hurt accessing the spring on Thomas's property, Thomas could be sued. For Christopher Doyle, this wasn't just about losing a legal battle. It was about losing access to something he'd relied on for decades. His property was more remote, harder to maintain without that water source. He'd had to pay to have a well drilled, an expensive undertaking that cost him nearly $8,000 on top of the legal fees. He told me, Hughes struggled to say, that Reed ruined him, destroyed his life, made him a laughingstock, took everything. In Christopher Doyle's mind, Thomas Reed hadn't just won a property dispute. He'd humiliated him, cost him thousands of dollars, and fundamentally altered how Doyle could use his own land. The resentment had festered for 3 years, growing more toxic with each interaction. Each time Doyle had to pay a bill for water he'd once gotten for free. Each time he drove past Thomas's property and thought about the injustice. It wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. It was a slow-burning rage that had been waiting for the right spark. Chen thanked Hughes for his time and left with a clearer picture. The motive was stronger than she'd thought. This wasn't just about a property line. It was about pride, humiliation, money, and a man who felt his neighbor had systematically destroyed his life. On August 3, 2007, 3 weeks before the trial was set to begin, Patricia Morse met with Christopher Doyle in the county jail's attorney meeting room. She carried a folder containing the prosecution's latest evidence, enhanced photos of the workshop floor showing the blood spatter pattern, expert testimony about the skull fractures, and a timeline that placed Doyle at the Morrison farm. "Christopher, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Morse said, her voice firm. "The prosecution has you. DNA doesn't lie. The jacket doesn't lie. If we go to trial, you will be convicted. The only question is whether you spend life in prison or face execution. Right now, the DA is offering a deal. Plead guilty to second-degree murder, they drop the death penalty, you get 25 to life with possibility of parole." Doyle stared at the table. He'd lost weight in jail, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. 4 months of incarceration had broken something in him. "I didn't plan it," he said quietly. Morse felt her heart rate increase. This was the first time he'd admitted anything. "What do you mean?" And then, finally, Christopher Doyle started talking. The story came out in fragments, punctuated by long silences and moments where Doyle seemed to retreat into himself. Morse recorded everything, knowing this was the break the case needed or the final piece that would seal her client's fate. According to Doyle's confession, he'd been in his workshop early on the morning of October 24, 2003, working on repairing a piece of equipment. Around 6 a.m., he heard a vehicle slow down on the road. Through his workshop window, he saw Thomas Reed's truck. Thomas wasn't stopping to talk. He was just driving past, heading to his hunting spot. But something about seeing that truck, seeing Thomas Reed going about his life while Doyle was still dealing with the financial aftermath of their legal battle, made something snap. Doyle went outside and flagged Thomas down. "I just wanted to talk," Doyle insisted. "I wanted him to understand what he'd done to me. How much it had cost. I thought maybe if I explained it right, he'd feel bad and offer to help with some of the costs." Thomas had pulled over, rolled down his window. "What do you want, Christopher?" "We need to talk. About the spring, about what this has cost me." "It's been 3 years. We're done talking. I've had to pay $8,000 for a new well, on top of your legal fees. I'm barely scraping by." "That's not my problem," the court ruled. "The spring is on my property. I'm sorry it's expensive, but that's how it is." According to Doyle, he'd asked, begged really, for Thomas to reconsider, to let him access the spring again, or at least help with some of the costs. They'd been neighbors for over 20 years. Couldn't Thomas show some compassion? Thomas had been firm. "I can't. My insurance won't allow it, and frankly, Christopher, you took me to court. You made this adversarial. You could have accepted the first surveyor's findings, but you didn't. You fought me every step of the way, and you lost. Now you're dealing with the consequences. Come inside, Doyle had said. Let me show you some documents. Maybe if you see the bills, the costs. Why Thomas agreed, Doyle didn't know. Maybe he felt sorry for his neighbor. Maybe he wanted to end the conversation on some kind of positive note. Maybe he was just being polite. But Thomas had parked his truck on the side of the road and followed Christopher to the workshop. That's where everything went wrong. In the workshop, Doyle showed Thomas the bills, the well drilling, the legal fees, the interest on credit cards he'd maxed out trying to cover everything. You did this, Doyle had said, his voice rising. You destroyed me. You took everything. I didn't do anything to you. You did this to yourself. I did this to myself? You're the one who... You started the legal battle. You called the county on me first. You hired a surveyor to dispute mine. You made this what it became. The argument escalated. Voices raised. Years of resentment spilled out. Thomas, according to Doyle's confession, had said something that pushed him over the edge. You're pathetic, Christopher. You lost a legal battle because you were wrong, and now you're crying about the consequences. That's on you. I'm done here. Thomas had turned to leave, and Christopher Doyle picked up a hammer from his workbench. I didn't plan it, Doyle repeated to his attorney, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw him walking away, dismissing me like I was nothing, and I couldn't let him leave like that. The first blow struck Thomas on the back of the head. He went down hard, hitting the concrete floor. He wasn't dead. He was trying to get up, dazed and bleeding, when the second blow fell. And then a third. And then Doyle couldn't stop. I didn't know I'd killed him at first, Doyle said. He stopped moving. There was so much blood. I tried to check if he was breathing, but he wasn't. He was just gone. Panic set in. Christopher Doyle stood in his workshop with his neighbor's body at his feet, realizing what he'd done. He couldn't call the police. This was murder. He couldn't explain it away. The evidence was everywhere. He had to hide it. He spent the next hour cleaning up what blood he could, though he knew he couldn't get it all. He wrapped Thomas's body in a tarp and hid it in a storage shed while he figured out what to do. The truck was a problem. It was sitting on the side of the road, visible to anyone driving by. Doyle searched Thomas's pockets and found his keys. He drove the truck to the hunting area parking lot, trying to make it look like Thomas had arrived there for his hunt. He locked the truck and left, walking back through the woods to avoid being seen on the roads. That night, under cover of darkness, he loaded Thomas's body into his own truck and drove to the Morrison farm. He knew the property well. He'd explored it as a teenager decades ago. He knew about the well. I thought the body would never be found, Doyle said. The well was dry, deep. No one went to that property anymore. I thought he'd just disappear. Like he'd vanished into the mountains. He'd returned a few days later with concrete, mixing it on site and pouring a slab over the well opening. He'd thought it would seal everything, hide the evidence forever, but he'd kept the jacket. He didn't know why. I should have buried it with him, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to that well. Every time I thought about it, I felt sick, so I just shoved it in my attic and tried to forget about it. For nearly 4 years, it worked. No one suspected him. The case went cold. Thomas Reed became just another missing person, another unsolved mystery. But I couldn't forget, Doyle admitted. Every single day I thought about it, what I'd done, what I'd taken from his family. I'd see his wife in town sometimes, and she'd look so broken. And I did that. I destroyed her life just like I felt Thomas destroyed mine. Patricia Morse looked at her client with a mixture of pity and revulsion. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm tired, Doyle said simply. I'm tired of lying. I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of being the person who did this. I want it to be over. On August 7th, 2007, Christopher Doyle officially changed his plea to guilty for second-degree murder. The trial was canceled. Instead, there would be a sentencing hearing where both sides could present their arguments for what punishment fit the crime. The prosecution recommended the maximum sentence, life in prison without possibility of parole. Even though the death penalty was off the table, they argued that Doyle's actions, the murder itself, the elaborate cover-up, the years of letting the Reed family suffer without answers, warranted the harshest punishment available. The defense argued for the minimum, 25 years with possibility of parole. Morse presented Doyle's confession as evidence of remorse, his cooperation as a mitigating factor. She argued that this was a crime of passion, not premeditated murder, and that Doyle had lived with tremendous guilt for years. On September 14, 2007, the courtroom was packed for the sentencing hearing. Margaret Reed sat in the front row, flanked by her children. She'd lost weight, her face drawn with grief, but her eyes were clear and focused. She'd waited 4 years for this moment. Judge Patricia Whitmore, a veteran of the bench known for her measured approach to sentencing, reviewed all the materials before her. Then she asked if anyone wished to make a statement. Margaret Reed stood. Her voice was steady, though tears streamed down her face. "Your Honor, Christopher Doyle didn't just take my husband from me. He took my husband from our children, from our grandchild, who will never know his grandfather. He took away my ability to say goodbye, to hold a proper funeral, to grieve the way a person should be allowed to grieve." She turned to look at Doyle directly. "For 4 years I hoped. Every single day I hoped that maybe Thomas was alive somewhere, that maybe he'd lost his memory, or was injured and couldn't find his way home. I held on to hope because I had no body, no proof. You gave me 4 years of false hope, Mr. Doyle, 4 years of torture." Her voice broke. "Thomas wasn't a perfect man, but he was a good man. He didn't deserve what you did to him. He didn't deserve to die over a property line and a water dispute. He didn't deserve to be dumped in a well like garbage and covered with concrete, and I didn't deserve to lose him that way." She wiped her eyes. "Whatever sentence you receive, it won't bring Thomas back. It won't give me those 4 years back. But I need you to understand that what you took from our family can never be replaced." When Margaret sat down, Amanda Reed stood next, her voice shaking with anger as she described showing her son pictures of the grandfather he'd never meet, explaining why Grandpa wasn't there for birthdays and holidays. Thomas's son spoke about the hole his father's absence had left in his life. Finally, Judge Whitmore asked Christopher Doyle if he wished to speak. Doyle stood, looking smaller somehow than he had months ago. His voice was hoarse. "I'm sorry. I know those words don't mean anything, don't fix anything, but I am. I'm sorry for what I did to Thomas. I'm sorry for what I put his family through. I'm sorry for the 4 years of not knowing. If I could take it back, I would. But I can't. So all I can do is say I'm sorry and accept whatever punishment you decide is appropriate." It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't enough. But it was, perhaps, the only honest thing Christopher Doyle had said since October 24th, 2003. Judge Whitmore took a 10-minute recess to consider the sentence. When she returned, the courtroom fell silent. "Mr. Doyle, this court has reviewed your confession, the evidence presented, and the statements made here today. While I acknowledge that you ultimately confessed and spared the Reed family the trauma of a trial, I cannot overlook the brutality of your actions and the calculated way you attempted to hide them." She paused, looking at Doyle over her glasses. "You murdered your neighbor in cold blood over a dispute about property and water. You then spent considerable effort hiding his body and covering your tracks. Most significantly, you allowed his family to suffer for 4 years without answers, without closure, without the ability to properly grieve their loss. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 35 years to life in state prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. You are now 60 years old. If you serve the minimum sentence, you will be 95 years old before you are eligible for parole. I suspect you will die in prison, Mr. Doyle, and perhaps that is appropriate justice for the life you took." The gavel fell. Margaret Reed closed her eyes, feeling something that wasn't quite relief, but wasn't quite satisfaction either. It was over. After 4 years of not knowing, after months of investigation and legal proceedings, it was finally over. Thomas could be properly buried now. A real funeral, with a casket and a headstone. She could visit his grave, bring flowers, talk to him the way she'd done in her head for 4 years. It wasn't the ending she'd wanted. Nothing could make this right. But it was an ending. And sometimes, that's all you can ask for. Thomas Reed was finally laid to rest on September 22, 2007, almost exactly 4 years after he disappeared. The funeral was held at the small church he and Margaret had attended for decades, the same church where they'd been married, where their children had been baptized, where Thomas had served as an usher for over 20 years. The turnout was enormous. The church seated 200 people, and there were at least another 100 standing outside, unable to fit inside but wanting to pay their respects. Thomas's friends and co-workers came. People from the community who'd participated in the original search came. Even some of the investigators who'd worked the case attended, including Detective Sarah Chen. The pastor, Reverend Michael Clayton, gave a eulogy that acknowledged both the tragedy of Thomas's death and the blessings of his life. He spoke about Thomas's dedication to his family, his work ethic, his quiet generosity. He acknowledged the anger and pain everyone felt about how Thomas died, but urged them to focus on how he lived. Thomas Reed was a good man who met an unjust end, Reverend Clayton said, but his legacy isn't about how he died. It's about how he lived. It's in the crib he was building for his grandson. It's in the home he built with Margaret. It's in the children he raised. It's in the kindness he showed his friends and the integrity he brought to his work. Death may have taken Thomas from us, but it cannot diminish who he was. Margaret had chosen a plot in the church cemetery under an old oak tree that Thomas had always admired. The headstone was simple. Thomas Allen Reed, 1951 to 2003. Beloved husband, father, and grandfather, gone too soon, never forgotten. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Margaret finally allowed herself to fully grieve. For 4 years, she'd held herself together, waiting for answers. Now, with those answers finally in hand, terrible as they were, she could let go. She wept openly, held by her children, as the man she'd loved for 28 years was finally given the burial he deserved. After the service, as people filed past to offer condolences, Detective Chen approached Margaret. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Reed. I wish we could have found him sooner." Margaret took Chen's hand in both of hers. "You found him. That's what matters. You gave him back to us. You gave us answers. Thank you." Chen nodded, unable to trust her voice. In 15 years of law enforcement, she'd worked dozens of cases, solved murders, put criminals away. But this one would stay with her. The image of Thomas Reed's truck with all his gear inside, evidence of a hunting trip that never happened. The skeleton at the bottom of a well, covered with concrete by a neighbor who'd killed over pride and money. The wife who'd waited 4 years for closure. Some cases you never forget. It wasn't until 3 months after Doyle's sentencing that the final piece of the puzzle emerged, a detail so small it had almost been overlooked, but so significant it changed everything about how people understood the case. A forensic accountant reviewing Doyle's financial records for civil proceedings, Margaret was suing Doyle's estate to recover damages, discovered something odd. In the weeks before Thomas's disappearance, Doyle had made several large cash withdrawals from his bank accounts. The total amount, $11,847. That seemed random until the accountant dug deeper. Doyle had been in severe financial trouble in 2003, far worse than anyone realized. He'd maxed out 3 credit cards, taken out a second mortgage on his property, and was facing foreclosure. The money he owed from the legal dispute with Thomas, the $4,000 in court costs and fees, had been the tipping point that pushed him toward bankruptcy. But here's what made it significant. Doyle had recently learned something that would have solved all his financial problems. The old Morrison farm, the abandoned property where Thomas's body was found, was being sold by the bank. Doyle had submitted a bid to purchase it, a lowball offer, but given the property's condition, potentially viable. If the sale went through, Doyle would have access to a natural spring on the Morrison property, making his water problems irrelevant. He'd also gain valuable acreage he could potentially resell or develop. The problem was timing. Doyle's bid was due November 1st, 2003, 8 days after Thomas disappeared, and part of the bid required a good faith deposit of $12,000, which Doyle didn't have. The cash withdrawals suggested Doyle had been scraping together every dollar he could find for that deposit. He'd been so close to solving his financial problems, so close to moving past the humiliation of his legal battle with Thomas. And then, on October 24th, 2003. He saw Thomas Reed driving past his property, heading off for a casual hunting trip, apparently without a care in the world. While Doyle was scrambling to save his financial life, Thomas, the man Doyle blamed for creating his financial crisis, was going hunting. It was that specific confluence of stress, resentment, and timing that created the perfect storm. Doyle hadn't planned to kill Thomas that morning, but seeing him in that moment when Doyle was at his absolute breaking point had triggered the rage that led to murder. This context didn't excuse what Doyle did. Murder is murder. But it explained the why in a way that the property dispute alone hadn't. This wasn't just about a 3-year-old legal battle. It was about a man who felt his entire life was crumbling because of his neighbor's actions, confronting that neighbor at the exact moment when his desperation was highest. Detective Chen shared this finding with Margaret, thinking she deserved to know the complete picture. Margaret listened quietly, then shook her head. So he killed my husband because Thomas was going hunting while Doyle was stressed about money. That's somehow worse than I thought. At least if it had been a planned thing, there would have been some logic to it, however twisted. But Thomas died because he happened to drive past at the wrong moment while Christopher Doyle was having a bad day. I'm sorry, Chen said. Don't be. It doesn't change anything, really. Thomas is still gone. Doyle is still in prison. But I guess it's good to know. The whole truth, I mean. Even when it's ugly. By 2012, the Thomas Reed case had largely faded from public consciousness, remembered only by those directly involved and by true crime enthusiasts who occasionally brought it up in online forums. Christopher Doyle remained in prison, serving his sentence. He'd requested a transfer closer to his cousin, his only remaining family, but had been denied. He worked in the prison library, kept to himself, and by all accounts was a model prisoner. Not that it mattered. He wouldn't be eligible for parole for another 25 years, and even then, the parole board was unlikely to release a convicted murderer in his 90s. Margaret Reed had slowly rebuilt her life. She still lived in the same house, though she'd finally cleaned out Thomas's closet and workshop. Some of his tools she'd given to their son. The unfinished crib had gone to Amanda, who'd ultimately let her own son help his grandmother complete it on what would have been Thomas's 60th birthday. It wasn't perfect, a child's hammering rarely is, but it was finished, and that meant something. Margaret had returned to work as a school librarian, finding solace in routine and the simple joy of helping children discover books. She'd stopped attending the support group for families of missing persons. Her husband wasn't missing anymore, but she stayed in touch with several members, understanding their pain in a way most people couldn't. She visited Thomas's grave every Sunday after church, bringing fresh flowers and talking to him about the week's events. Their grandson was 7 now, a bright boy who loved baseball and asked questions about everything. He looks like you, Margaret told the headstone. Same eyes, same stubborn streak. Detective Sarah Chen had since been promoted to lead investigator for the State Police Major Crimes Unit. The Reed case had been a turning point in her career, the solve that proved she had what it took to crack even the coldest cases. She kept a photo of Thomas Reed on her desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that behind every case was a family waiting for answers, and that persistence and attention to detail could bring those answers home. The teenagers who'd found Thomas's body, now in their early 20s, had all gone on with their lives, though the experience had marked each of them. Jake had become an EMT, driven by a desire to help people in crisis. Riley had gone to law school, inspired to seek justice for victims. Marcus worked in IT, and Devin was a teacher. None of them talked about that night much, but all of them remembered. The old Morrison farm had eventually been sold to a developer who cleared the property and built 3 new houses. The well where Thomas's body had been found was filled in with concrete and dirt, marked on the property survey but otherwise invisible. New families lived there now, unaware of the tragedy that had occurred on their land. Life, as it always does, had moved on. In March 2013, Margaret Reed received a letter from Christopher Doyle, the man who murdered her husband Thomas. Against her instincts, she opened it. Inside, Doyle confessed that he hadn't acted alone. His cousin, David Brennan, had been there, encouraged the killing, and helped cover it up. Detective Sarah Chen reopened the case. Doyle, terminally ill with cancer, told her he was confessing before he died. He described how Brennan pushed him to finish it, helped hide the body in an old well, and faked Thomas's disappearance. Chen investigated Brennan, discovering a violent history and troubling coincidences. Cell tower data placing him near the crime scene, unexplained cash deposits, and a witness recalling him buying concrete and tarps soon after the murder. In April 2013, Brennan was arrested and charged. His 2013 trial centered on whether Doyle's dying confession could be trusted. The defense claimed Doyle, bitter and dying, wanted revenge. The prosecution argued the evidence backed Doyle's account. Doyle, frail and dying, testified that Brennan urged him to kill and helped cover up the crime. "I'm not trying to save myself," he said. "I'm trying to tell the truth." The jury found Brennan guilty on all counts. On October 25, 2013, 10 years to the day after Thomas's death, he was sentenced to 25 years to life. Doyle died 3 weeks later. Margaret Reed finally had justice, though no peace. "It took 10 years," she said, "but Thomas can rest now." Years later, the people involved moved on. Chen retired, Brennan aged in prison. Margaret continued her Sunday visits to Thomas's grave. She tells their grandson, now grown, that anger and pride destroyed their family's happiness. Thomas Reed's death began with a neighbor's grudge and ended with 2 men in prison. The mountains where he planned to hunt still stand, indifferent. The well is sealed, the land rebuilt, but the tragedy endures as a warning. Unchecked resentment can turn ordinary lives into lifelong sorrow.